Hey friends, this is Joseph Maynor. I'm doing this video while I'm traveling, so I don't have my normal setup here. Hopefully that's okay. Uh, my usually my lighting and my audio isn't that great anyway, so it's not such a significant step down from what we're used to with me thus far. But what I want to do in this video, I feel compelled to make a video um, on sort of this same line of thought that we've been considering, which is emotions and really the role of emotions to spirituality. Not just positive emotions, but negative emotions too. And also getting into like what are emotions? What are feelings? What are affects? All these kinds of words seem to be uh, and it depends on how we want to slice, how thin we want to slice the bologna, right? Sometimes, no pun intended, or not. Maybe there's a really accurate distinction between these things. Some people seem to think that there are, and I don't want to necessarily take that away from them. However, this is a really important area of contemplation, and I feel like a lot of people, for some reason, never really thoroughly investigate emotions, especially with regard to spirituality, and even more particularly with regard to spiritual enlightenment. So, this is a tricky area, um, and I've dealt with people who have had different ideas about emotions. Some people seem to completely think that emotions are entirely like human or something to be seen through is entirely ego. Other people seem to take a really radically opposite direction, that emotion is really the center of truth, right? And so, what do we make of this, right? Different philosophical, metaphysical perspectives with regard to emotion in spiritual enlightenment itself. And I've dealt with all these kinds of people. I've dealt with these issues myself. I tend to, again, right, without beating a cliche to death, I tend to take a middle way here. I don't get overly analytical or psychological or sort of nerdy about emotions. Um, but at the same time, I recognize the importance of emotion. So I'm not going to be the kind of person who's going to create you know, an emotional scale and talk about how to elevate yourself up an emotional scale. That's not never been my approach to spirituality. And in fact, I've, had some disagreements with people who have actually held that very perspective. But at the same time, I don't resonate with people who seem to think that emotions are always determined by ego. I think this is another oversimplification. And so, where does that put me? Well, again, it depends on how we want to slice the bologna, right? Is intuition a feeling or an emotion? This is all very philosophical. What's the difference between like a feeling and an emotion? Like, is an emotion a feeling that's been kind of pre programmed by the ego? Or post programmed, actually, rather, post programmed. In other words, you have a feeling, maybe or maybe not. I mean, it could be pre or post, but let's do them in order. Let's say first you have a feeling, and that's kind of like the raw sensory experience. So, for example, you perceive the feeling of discontent or something like that, or the feeling of contentment. Is an emotion a feeling that has been coupled with some kind of philosophy or thought or something that's made it conditioned. Okay, that's one kind of avenue or route you can go down. And that seems to be very popular with people, Neo Advaita people, people that follow, Abraham Hicks, these kinds of people. They're not going to deny that feeling exists, as far as I know, and as far as my experience with them is. But what they don't like is they don't like thought, right? They don't like thought influencing feeling. Somehow, when thought influences feeling, corruption happens to feeling, and it turns feeling into emotion. And these people are very sensitive to this, and they have a whole philosophy around avoiding this. But fundamentally, they feel like truth or absolute truth, as the core of their spirituality, is very much centered around feeling. They just don't like the word emotion, and they don't like feeling that's been sort of corrupted by a separate self or an ego or something like that. They have that kind of mentality. Then you have people who start, I guess really these aren't not really disagreements. You have people that start with an emotion, and then they want to unpack the egoic aspect of the emotion to get at the underlying feeling. So, for example, somebody, and I'm not an expert at this by any means. That's why I'm actually kind of fascinated by this, because people who are interested in emotions fascinate me anyway. But like, let's say you start with anger. You're angry at something. Somebody said something to you, right? And you reacted to it angrily. Uh, then we can go the other way. We can deconstruct the anger, which is seen as an emotion, and we can separate the feeling from the thought. So, in other words, we're not going to deny the feeling of frustration, maybe, but what we're going to criticize is we're going to criticize the framing of that frustration as, first of all, my frustration, which is already a thought, right? It's my frustration. So that's already a kind of a belief in a separate self. Um, Rather than just frustration, just being frustration. Nobody owns the frustration. The feeling of frustration is not the emotion of frustration as we typically think that it is. Okay. Um, you know what, and I've never really been sympathetic toward this kind of a view, to be honest. Just to be honest. And it's caused a lot of disagreement between me and people who are. And you know what? I prefer moving forward that it doesn't have to. I mean, I feel like we can disagree. The best thing we can do is continue the conversation. That's the best thing we can do is continue the conversation, right? I'm all for continuing the conversation. But what I find is that there's a kind of hunkering down with regard to perspectives on emotion that just causes people to start reacting toward each other ironically, and it breaks this. It's like, if you don't agree with me, you're some kind of a blah, right? We all know how that goes. Um, but I still very heavily value, I'm just going to call them emotions. Um, and the way I look at it, kind of the middle way perspective, which is kind of weird because in many ways I'm highly philosophical, but also in many ways I'm very practical too. So I don't like to over intellectualize something that really doesn't need to be over intellectualized. So to me, emotions are actually very simple. Uh, and there is some truth to being able to pull out the egoic component of emotions. You know, the whole go get your man meme, that women talk about. That makes sense because men are the individual, right? The masculine. Not all uh, not all men are masculine necessarily. There are plenty of women that are very masculine as well. So masculine and feminine that doesn't really go with gender in a one-to-one way. But the masculine in general is much more individualistic. And so sometimes the masculine, which includes men and women, will double down in a way that can be perceived as selfish by the feminine. But also, the feminine can double down in ways that can be perceived as selfish by the masculine as well, in how they hitch their wagon toward linking up in relationship with individuals and with groups. So there's ego in both, right? There's the collective ego and there's the individual ego. So, and both involve emotions, believe me. I mean, if you want lots of emotions, hang out with somebody who is very feminine, right? Now, and if you want to experience kind of like, cat fights and stuff like that, I mean, this whole idea um, that we are these kind of, or that we should be these emotionally sterile entities, it feeds into this whole narrative that emotions are only of the ego, they're of the human, and they need to be ditched in favor of this almost like, Spock kind of mentality, or I don't know, Muji mentality. It's like, oh, Muji never gets angry, or Adyashanti never gets angry, or, I mean, you know what I'm saying? Come on. This is ridiculous fantasy and performance. It's a hope, it's a wish. You're basically saying, this is how we should be. It's a moral claim, right? Versus this is how it is. So you have to look at this is how it should be, or this is how I should be. You're looking at the future. You're not grounded in the present there. Instead of saying these are the feelings that actually come up in direct experience for me. That should be the focus. So you don't want to get ahead of yourself or behind yourself. So the way that now that I frame this issue in the first half of this video, I think the second half of this video is I want to talk about sort of my approach to dealing with emotions in light of all of these conversations that I've had for at least 10 years. And how I deal with emotions in my day-to-day life, and some takeaways that I've had with regard to emotion in my own life as well, both positive and negative. I'm not the kind of person who says never judge yourself. That's ridiculous, right? But I'm also the kind of person that doesn't overly judge myself either, because I don't expect myself to be some kind of perfect fantasy being. See, to me, that's like you're thinking about what you want to be or want to become instead of what you actually are. See, so this is why direct experience, the present moment, being mindful, but then also deconstructing ego and understanding ego in the context of emotions, I think is also very important. But in my opinion, this can be expressed very practically. It doesn't need to be loaded with philosophy so much. I mean, obviously, it's going to have some philosophy to it. All of this has philosophy to it. Okay, friends, so we're halfway through the video. I'll come back and I'll basically explain how I deal with emotions. So just give me one second. All right, friends, welcome back. So, the first thing for me, which is just obvious, is I can perceive emotions the same way that I perceive anything. And also my intuition. I can perceive my intuition too. Um, like I'm aware all the time, even when I'm reacting. Or let's say I'm in conflict, or you know what I mean? I'm aware of that all the time. And there's a measure of uh, there's a measure of how much reason is weighing in on my awareness sometimes, or the lack thereof. This is a good example of this is like picking your battles, right? Um, but I've never been the kind of person who thinks like a chess master in life. Like to me, that's not my style. Um, I tend to go with how I feel. I mean, I'm a jazz musician, right? I mean, so ultimately, what guides me is intuition, and I try to have my intuition link up with spirituality. But sometimes um, my intuition can run away with me, just like somebody's intellect can run away with them, or someone's emotions can run away with them too. So I can be, if anything, accused of being overly intuitive, and I accept that. I mean, I'm an INFJ, so introverted intuition is my number one cognitive function. So that's just me. I'm just going to be the person who's just like super intuitive, and that has pros and cons to it. But but I definitely do feel my emotions very clearly, and I can identify them very clearly. I know when I'm angry. I know when something feel even morality to me has a feeling to it. It's not entirely just reason alone. So morality, it's like if I can tell when things are right or wrong. So in other words, like I can see through my own ego to a degree and just tell, generally speaking, whether something is right or wrong. I don't dismiss morality entirely because, again, I don't. I'm not saying that the human is false. The duality between the human and the divine is not a real duality. See, um, but so I think the first thing is stop the moral grandstanding, but also denying morality too. Stop, the white knighting thing. Like I'm so perfect because I'm unreactive. No, you're not, right? I've seen instances of everybody reacting. So that and even if you're heavily criticizing people, you can tell, you can read the tone of somebody's words and tell like, this person is really angry, right? So some people, they I guess they just want to deny morality and they want to deny anger and they want to deny the human because they feel like these are somehow stupid or below them, but they're not below them. They're below what they want to become, which is a future orientation. They're not grounded in the present. Right? How could that be beneath you if you're exhibiting it, right? See? So again, I think step one is to become a kind of person that's grounded in the present moment. That's number one. Um, be grounded in the present moment. With regard to emotions. All we're talking about here is emotions. So be grounded in the present moment. Um, and then two, develop emotional awareness. Now this can be misconstrued. Let me see. Develop emotional awareness. This doesn't mean you analyze your emotions. Although your intuition is always kind of analyzing your emotions. That's not the same thing as the mind analyzing your emotions, though. So you do want to pay attention to fluctuations in feeling or emotion. And sometimes these are very subtle. You don't need to name them all the time. Right? This idea that one should always be identifying their emotions. Can you imagine eating a meal or watching a movie where you're in such analysis mode that you can't even enjoy the meal, or you can't enjoy, nobody does that. Nobody enjoys art that way. Nobody enjoys creation that way. That's an overly analytical, reductionistic kind of mentality to have. And I'm not saying that's bad necessarily. Sometimes that can be good, but that's not the only approach to enjoying a meal. That's not the only approach to enjoying your feeling either. This idea, oh, I gotta sit back like a weird scientist and pigeonhole every feeling that I'm feeling into some kind of emotional category. Nobody does that, nor should they do that. I mean, maybe you could do that as an exercise in the present moment, but don't think that ideally, see, this idealism, you know, people don't really know how to treat realism versus idealism. You know, they, they, instead of being grounded in the present moment, they're thinking in terms of what I should be. You see the morality there too? What I should be. Because what I am, I'm blind to that. I'm not even looking at that. See, that's where you need direct experience, especially with regard to emotional and intuitive um, work. And that's why I think my training as a jazz musician actually created this naturally in me, because the way jazz musicians operate on the bandstand is you're always listening, you're always in the present moment, and you're trying to figure out what the music needs from you. So it forces you to become very feeling oriented, in the present moment. You're not thinking unless you have to. So this whole sort of like thinking aspect of spirituality, uh, it's good, but it has limits to it. It can be overly um, ideal, overly conceptual. Kind of, I wouldn't call it a bypass, but I would call it like a misalignment almost. But then again, other people will say I'm misaligned too. I mean, all of us are misaligned to some extent, right? First of all, accept your own misalignment. But then only you can really determine what becoming more aligned is. Somebody else can't tell you what that means. Not forever. And if they can, it's like, man, that's sad, right? Um, and so I do agree on a higher level that that we're gonna all think very differently on these topics. But I would say that, yeah, don't become too nerdy about emotional awareness. This is where I kind of disagree with the whole Abraham Hicks emotional scale thing, where you're supposed to kind of move up the emotional scale and identify your emotions really clearly and make all these distinctions between feeling versus emotion and understand this kind of ideal absolute love that the no separate self person feels. I get that. I've dealt with people who believe that, right, for a long time. I would say more power to you, man, if that works for you. Uh, and I would also avoid a kind of Zen reductionistic pragmatic approach too, where it's like all philosophy is seen as a kind of joke, and all you really have is direct experience, right? No, right? That's not really the case either, because we do have intellect, we have reason, Yeah, we have sense experience, we have reason, and then we have intuition. So in terms of my epistemology, but and they go in an order. So in other words, like reason can correct sense experience, and this is where you flip out in a way where it's like it's obvious that like you didn't choose your battle in a way that was good for you, good for anyone, right? It was just like these are the moments where you're like, I did something really stupid, man, right? But if you think about it, not all conflict is stupid. In fact, the people who don't engage enough in conflict, that's not good either. Sometimes it's appropriate to fight with somebody, right? But you want to do it reasonably. So I think we can all agree that unreasonable negative emotions um, only on your own judgment though can be perceived to be kind of like a regret if you had to do it all over again. But then I would also say also have no regrets either of what happened in the past. So it's a paradox. On the one hand, you do want to say, "Oh, I did something stupid," but on the other hand, you want to say, "Hey, look, there's no way that I could fix that. There's no way actually I could change what I did. I could fix it potentially by taking actions into the future, but there's no way that I could change what actually happened." And you can hold both of those as a paradox. But I think intuition trumps reason too. Like if I'm not creating the way that I feel is right, then what does being reasonable have to offer me? You know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of what I call jazz machines. These are people who they don't really improvise very much. They memorize a bunch of licks and they memorize a bunch of techniques from other jazz musicians. And so when they play on the bandstand, it's almost like they're executing all this stuff that they have like pre-planned and in many ways mastered that way. Versus someone like me who has zero. I don't have anything explicitly memorized. I don't even go that route. I go entirely based off of improvisation. Um, Sometimes I'll have some things that I've kind of developed as a matter of playing a song a bunch of times, but that stuff is not. I'm not thinking anything while I'm improvising. I'm not thinking anything unless I lose the form or something where it's like, oh shit, then my thinking mind engages. But when I'm improvising, it's entirely intuition. Thinking takes, in a way, kind of a back seat. So it's like sense experience, so it's what I'm hearing, then thinking or reason, but then intuition is ultimately driving the show. So I can live with what I create, even if it's unreasonable, right? So that's just my style. That's my spirituality. That reflects my epistemology. That reflects my personality type. So, yes, emotions can be, in hindsight, seen as unreasonable. But then what? So, what I would say, first of all, is take yourself off the hook for feeling like you need to be perfect. But I would say too, uh, and realize you're going to express the whole panoply of emotions. Is criticism sometimes useful? Yes. Is being more aware of emotions useful? Yes. Sense experience and reason, respectively. But ultimately, as a creator, uh, as a conscious creator, the better thing would just be okay with what you're consciously creating and not feeling like you need to be perfect. Like sometimes you're still going to train wreck a tune, right? Sometimes you're going to watch somebody else train wreck a tune. You're going to get pissed off and you might like say something on the bandstand inappropriate to that person. It happens to everybody, right? Somebody might call you out in public and you may be having a bad day and you may get into a fight with that person where you're just looking at like both of these people are stupid actually, right? Unreasonable. But then, you know, that's reason, right? That's not as high as intuition. So again, intuition controls reason. Intuition is a higher uh, way of being than reason. And reason, in a way, is a higher way of being than just raw sense experience. Reason is what allows you to have that inner thought in there that's going, you know, maybe I don't have to behave like a chimpanzee, right? So anyway, friends, so hopefully I was able to give you guys just my perspective on emotions and in much more of a context to how I actually operate too, because emotions in a way are a topic. It's like sectioning out this, you know, it's just that, no, it's like when I'm eating chicken fried steak, right? I'm not really, sometimes I am analyzing it, okay? But I'm enjoying these, or, you know, I'm enjoying the experience of sharing a meal with other people. There is some analysis going on though, just because I'm a cook, but I try not to let that overtake the experiencing the flow, the creation and the moment of sharing the meal with people and trying to create that into a humorous and enjoyable experience for everybody involved. It's a performance, right? Okay, friends, hopefully this is a good video and I'll talk to you soon. Take care.